All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Edwards, and I am a public historian here in Richmond. And I'm really pleased to be facilitating or participating in this conversation with Brian Palmer, who's a photojournalist here in Richmond, and Sukenya Best, who is a coordinator for the Artmobile project with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. This film and discussion is part of the Afrikana Independent Film Festival this year, which of course, as you can tell, is being done virtually, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate in this way. The two people, aside from me, who are in this conversation are, of course, Brian Palmer. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm Brian Palmer. I'm a Richmond-based journalist, photojournalist, and text journalist, and radio journalist, and University of Richmond visiting professor and cemetery volunteer, too.
Great. And Sukenya, please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sukenya Best. I've been with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts going on my second year now, working with the Artmobile, where we outreach and we travel around the Virginia Commonwealth, presenting a piece of the permanent collection to communities, and I'm glad to be here.
All right. So our conversation is going to be centered on one of the films that was produced for the Artmobile. It features Brian, and it's him talking about the photograph that's included in the exhibition that's part of that Artmobile exhibit, which is the second, I understand, of the program for this go-round. And it's called VMFA on the Road, the exhibit, A View from Home, Landscapes of Virginia. And Brian's photograph, which he will talk about, is a really interesting lens, a way of looking and seeing both the present and the past, I think, of Richmond in that space. And I watched the film earlier today and a couple days ago as well, to sort of try to get a sense of not just the film itself, but also, sort of what it's trying to say in relationship to the idea of home and landscapes and Virginia and history and in the present. And so I think that many of the points that you make speak to the things that are happening in Richmond at this moment, and the ways in which maybe having an experience with the East End and Evergreen cemeteries are creating these linkages. One is the discovery, I think, of the site. The other is sort of discovering the issues that lie within the site as you are uncovering the names and the stories of people that are there, but also the way in which the site is now being engaged in terms of the idea of reclamation, restoration, stewardship, governance, all of those things which speak to the state of the Black community in America in many ways. So I'll start really just with that, and then I'd like to go ahead and throw it open so that you can, just respond to those, my initial thoughts of what I saw. And as we go through the conversation, I do have some questions that I'll throw out there. But mostly what I like is for us to have a robust three-way conversation. I think that's really the best way to go about it. So your initial thought.
Me or Sukenya?
You, because.
Okay, me.
Yeah, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Sukenya. Yeah.
Okay. Well, reflecting on that short film, I felt like I was simultaneously wearing a bunch of hats, and both advocate for East End and Evergreen Cemetery, photographer, journalist, all of the things that I do. So I felt like it's not so much censoring as being conscious that I'm an ambassador and that I am the first point of contact for a lot of people who will see these sacred sites through my eyes. So I was very conscious of that. And sometimes it's difficult to address all of the issues that you want to address injustice, stewardship, all of those things, which I think is actually appropriate because fundamentally these are outdoor archives, sacred sites, and they are just incredible public assets. They're incredible community assets. So all of the noise and all of the politics, we need to deal with those, obviously. But fundamentally, we have to introduce people to why these places matter. And these places matter because so many African Americans were laid to rest there in East End and in Evergreen between the late 1800s, really up until mid 20th century. And some folks were buried thereafter, but these were among the few places that folks could be buried. And you have a cross section of the African American community, and therefore you have a cross section of African American stories in this country and American stories. So if you want to understand anything, if you want to understand America, if you want to understand the context for the monuments, the Confederate monuments we always talk about, you have to understand these cemeteries, who's there, how they got into the present condition, and what their condition was before.
Right.
These were beautiful memorial parks that African Americans created for themselves, and the forces of Jim Crow kind of pulled things apart.
Right. When you, one of the things that some of the footage of the film reveal is the layout. You begin to get a sense of the layout and the formality of it, and that it was clearly a designed space. And so Kenya, I'd like you to sort of talk, also about the role that you think that the story of this cemetery and the way that Brian is talking about it plays into the outreach component of this exhibit. Landscapes from Virginia. What does that mean?
Yes. I will go into a little bit of the mind of the curator, Jeffrey Allison. He's head of the statewide program. He also worked with in-house to create the film, and he's my supervisor. So he's the reason why the 21st century Artmobile is on the road. And when he saw Brian's piece, he had to have it, in this exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
The exhibition, his idea was to explore and show landscapes all over the Commonwealth. And a part of that is the description of the exhibition, which is to explore the diversity and the beauty of nature unspoiled and how it impacts human activity on the Virginia landscape. And Brian's photograph talks about it through a 21st century lens. We have works on board that were created in the mid 1800s, and Brian's is the most contemporary piece on board, created in 2017. So the telling of Evergreen and the East End Cemetery is incredible, and it's a way for us to show what is happening in terms of unveiling and renovating and bringing forth the African American history and community that's right here within our backyard here in Richmond. And so what's interesting is that as the video highlights the restoration and all that it's involved, well, a piece of it that's involved in terms of all that it takes, the imagery of the kudzu, and then the story behind that, the narrative. When I think about the communities that we go into and who we meet and how we talk to, it's an intergenerational outreach. So we talk to young and old or seasoned. And a lot of times we work with the school system, and we have fourth graders, fifth graders, sixth graders, all the way through college come on board. And many of them are within the African community as a part of how we serve a diverse group. And it's to me, it's going to be so impactful to hear the clarity and the affirmation and the knowing that Brian has with this project in terms of where he belongs. You know, there are quotes there
Mm.
that I'm like, they're so
Mhm.
powerful, you know, in terms of this is mine, you know. And so when
Yes.
the young people come on board and they can be inspired with seeing land that is also yours. And
Right.
so
Right.
I'm really excited to have conversations with the people who will come on board. We've gone to Danville during this COVID time. We went in July, and it was a soft residency, but the people we saw there really responded to Brian's photograph and his piece. And it's interesting because they know a lot about kudzu. And they asked, why is there a photograph of kudzu?
Right.
And
Right.
then when they saw the video operates as a support, and it furthers the content to the imagery. So they really appreciated the introduction.
Mhm.
Many of them said they lived around there and didn't know it was there. And they were asking about how they could further their research of the project. So
Mhm.
it was really getting a lot of feedback, and
Yeah.
especially in Danville, where they have a high appreciation for their cemetery. So it was they really understood the importance of your project, and they wanted to know more about it.
Sure.
That's exciting.
You know, I'm going to throw in this piece because one of the questions that sort of struck me was the fact that we kind of in some ways we're sort of pitting nature against human activity, and pitting the preservation of the environment in some instances has literally come up against the need to preserve historic spaces and protect memory and assert memory. And so I kind of see that clash coming into being
Mm.
in the way that nature is doing what nature does, right? It's reclaiming that space. There's fertile land there. It can grow, and you have these trees and these plants and the kudzu, that are
Mhm.
growing and thriving there. And yet, there's this really important human task that you all are working on, and that people have gone to that cemetery, to such an extent that you claim it. You claim the space, you claim the history, you claim the people. Do you think about that while you're out there?
That's actually a really wonderful point, Anna, because cemeteries are fundamentally unnatural places, right? Persons, men, women, humanoids are trying to carve their will into the landscape, into nature. And usually we see cemeteries in a state where that process has been fairly successful, right? So the lawns are trimmed, headstones, if they're fallen down, maybe they'll be picked up, so on and so forth. We see the result of the absence of that, but even more so, we see the power of nature to transform that person-made landscape. And I think that's what's most interesting here, because when those young people were looking at that kudzu, as Sukenya, I think, was telling us, they didn't see a cemetery. They didn't know it was a cemetery. So in one small sense, it's a metaphor for hidden African American history, but only in a tiny sense, because it's real. The history is under that kudzu, and the kudzu is there for a reason, not just because someone let nature grow, but someone starved this cemetery of the resources that would be required for regular folk to maintain it. So that balance between people and nature is something that has to be struck by people, and people need resources to do that. So the impact the damage, the consequences of Jim Crow are etched in that landscape. And we talk as volunteers, as descendants, as citizens, we talk about how we want to see this place now, because nature has done some damage that may be irreparable, and it would take millions and trillions of dollars to come in and change and fix everything and level everything. So you have to accept that there's going to be a balance between what nature has done and what people want undone. And we feel that that's not a hard thing to achieve. You just have to decide, okay, where do we draw the line? We're going to get rid of the invasive species. We'll figure out a way to tame the kudzu so we can see the headstones. And if we can fix things that are actually damaged, we do that. But the trees and all that, they're going to coexist. So it's going to be a space different from other cemeteries, but it'll be unique, East End and Evergreen, if descendants and volunteers had their way.
Right. It also speaks to this idea of you as a photographer, the piece and the and the site itself, and this idea of you're coming to know it, you're coexisting with it, and moving perhaps from documentation to interpretation, right? And you speak a little bit about that in the film. Actually, you speak a lot about it in the film, as partly your journey as a photographer as a whole, but it's also your journey with this particular cemetery. And it also couldn't help bringing to mind, for me, because I'm familiar with it, your experience with an ancestral family cemetery, which you cannot access. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And then from there, Sukenya, I'd like you to also sort of weigh in on this idea of documentation versus interpretation, that intersection with art and photography and, landscape.
I may have said this in the short film, so forgive me if I repeat myself, but this is something that I say to my journalism students and to young photographers, that for those of us who are committed to representing the world around us in creative ways, we need to navigate between, or on this continuum between the literal, and lyrical. So if something is so literal, it's boring, right? You take your camera out and you click something and it's just a direct representation of something. That's dull. But if it's so lyrical that it's, I'm expressing my navel kind of thing, you don't get a sense of what was there, what I'm trying to interpret for the viewer. And there is, as you said, Anna, necessary interpretation. That particular photograph, when I took it, we had been volunteering at the cemetery probably around 2 years by then. And I have to say that is the product of a lot of frustration and sadness and failure and literalness that didn't really make the pictures interesting. But because to be literal is to leave nothing to the imagination. And my temptation, I think, in making an image at a cemetery, you gotta put a headstone in there, right? Or a bunch of headstones. But the point with this place is that how kudzu in this particular area cyclically swallows things. And that cycle can be interrupted if people care, if people value the site. So we go back and forth, but I was there at a moment where I had to express this part of the cycle where the uncaring was reflected in the landscape. I know what's under there. Maybe the viewer doesn't unless he or she reads the caption or just recognizes, Evergreen Cemetery. So I had to restrain myself, and I feel that the visual equivalent of that was a little bit more lyrical, is to let people see that space see the green and that partial road, and really think, really ponder what they're seeing, and then maybe be surprised and confounded when they figure out, oh, this is a cemetery. And that's when you start thinking, well, gosh, what's under all of that kudzu? Why is kudzu covering a cemetery all in? So for me, it took 2 some odd years of just working as a visual artist and a documentarian, and finding the space where I felt my pictures were most effective visually and also emotionally. And I'm still working through that. How many years later? Three plus years later.
Sure. And I would think that, senses of progress and regression in terms of the reclamation, that literal process would have an effect on what you see as revealing, or concealing, every time you go back to the site.
Yes. And there's another, I guess, part of the story. Sounds like someone is typing. Someone typing? Okay, so I think maybe that's just the signal. But for the first year and a half, 2 years that I went out to the cemetery, and both to document and to clean the place up, I was really laden with a sense of tragedy, shame and tragedy. This is an African American site, and look at it. Even if I knew that these places were starved of resources because Jim Crow legislators, white legislators, took public money and sent them to white spaces and deprived black spaces of taxpayer dollars, I understood that. But to see it and to immerse yourself in it was really, really difficult for me, because you just get so angry. And then you get absorbed in the process. And the process requires both of these processes to document and make art and to restore the site. You have to look closely. You have to look at the headstones. You have to take care not to scrape and scratch them. And when you do that, you read the words. And when you read the words, you see the love. You see the care that sons and daughters and classmates and co-workers and fellow churchgoers invested in honoring these people. And that's when stuff transforms. And that's when a change, this drive, this need to introduce people to this place, to interpret this place in ways that people can actually understand it and feel the value. Mm-hmm. So I do that with a camera and with my hands, but we have a whole ton of volunteers who work really, really hard to provide access, literal access, to families' burial plots, giving people access they haven't had for 30 and 40 years. So that's their art.
Right.
And I can tell you that people who come to the cemetery are absolutely appreciative, because they come when we're working, they come when we're doing whatever, but we're there.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. It's, yeah.
So Kenya, what do you think of that, especially when we're talking about documentation versus interpretation?
Mm-hmm. In working with the museum and having the images documented in terms of archived, within our photography department, and using that process in terms of when you're curating a show, you go to the archives to look at the documentation of the interpretation of the artist. And a lot of times that's a way to select the works that would be within the exhibition. Also, in terms of interpretation, what we do in terms of making sure that the content is there, the signage, the labeling, so that there is context to the interpretation. What's interesting is when you go into a museum, you have the chance to at first experience the artwork, and just look at the artwork itself, and then choosing to read the information behind it. It really depends on the viewer. It depends on the visitor, the audience. And there have been people who come on the Artmobile and they've decided to perhaps read all the labels before they look at the artwork first, as they go to one piece, read the label, or they decide to do it the opposite way. Um, Being on a mobile, being transporting, going and traveling the landscape of Virginia, it's very interesting that within the exhibition, we have 10 other artists in addition to Brian, and the different styles and interpretations, some being more literal, some being more lyrical, in terms of, that's when we talk about representation or abstract work. And there's a variety of styles on board. I can't fail to mention that there's a team of 3 of us. So I'm one of 2 coordinators. My colleague Sean Kane is another coordinator, and then we have our driver, our well-experienced driver, William Hairston, also. So we work together in terms of sharing the artists and information about the process, but it's also a dialogue. So we're often very careful in not saying everything, giving the visitor a chance to take in and to digest and to formalize their own opinions. And oftentimes before COVID, we were able to do gallery activities on board with the specific tours, school tours. And we were able to ask them questions in terms of, what are you seeing in this piece? And, formal questions with composition and color and space, but also questions about what do you see in terms of, what do you think the artist is trying to get across? What's the intent of the artist from your point of view with what is presented in front of you?
Right.
And what we've noticed since last year is a high appreciation for the videos. I remember when I was going to school, we had to enroll in a class in order to get a special uh, one-on-one or a private group of visitors, of the visiting artists, to really share insight in their minds and their processes. And what the video does, it shares a glimpse of that. And oftentimes we share this information with the teachers and with the different groups that we work with or that we partner with. We partner with over 1,000 statewide partner programs in education, within the community, um, and within the museums. And last year, we went to over 40 residencies, and we saw over 100,000 people with different events. So it has been a joy. And it has been interesting in terms of what people will receive and what people won't receive. But because of the diversity within the works, there are paintings, there's photographs, and there's fine art printmaking. And so the work really spans in terms of, well, what do you define as landscape, through the eyes of what the artist chooses to put within this framed context.
Yeah, for me, the intersection between, say, photojournalism and photo art is really interesting, because if the image is truly successful to the artist's vision, you are in essence looking through a window. You're no longer thinking about composition or any of the sort of formalist breakdown of the image or even the artist. You really are yourself now in the piece and in the place that they are creating. And I did see that in a couple of the other pieces in watching the film that was just about the Artmobile and the overall exhibit. And I thought it was interesting too that, Brian, the image that that was chosen for this exhibit is the one with the least details, the least. You really do have to know. You have to be told the context in order to begin to move past, the green of that particular landscape. And again, I wanted to sort of touch a little bit on this idea of, the artist's vision as it's coming through in the video, but as you were talking about it. We don't have that much more time, but I wanted you maybe to speak to, um, for example, you talked about slowing down in order to begin to see what you were seeing, right? You could take a picture of headstones. You could take a picture of a tree growing near a marker. You could do those kinds of, as you say, documentary kinds of things. You could also spend a lot of time taking very beautiful photographs of any number of things. The ones with the daylilies, I noticed in looking at your book earlier today. And daylilies are resilient, if nothing else, almost as kudzu. But I think it was the idea that when I looked at one of the images where you describe slowing down and the person that's in the image is blurred, and yet the landscape is very clear. The place itself is very clear. And I thought that was a really effective way, maybe because of watching films where we see, slow motion action intended to show a passage of a much greater period of time, right? So again, this idea of how what you see in your head makes its way out through the lens and in a photograph of actual objects, I think is really an interesting way to contemplate translating subject to actual vision.
Oh, that's that. So I have some kind of feedback. That is super perceptive and wonderful, Anna, because I think that, so everybody's going to interpret a picture in particular ways, and I can't control that. But that image, and I think my best images from East End and Evergreen are the product of me being filled up with that history, filled up with all of those emotions, and positive, negative, everything, and then just letting my eye and my hands and my camera go to work. So it's not like I'm responding to my navel, but I'm trusting myself enough to respond to the light, the scene. I don't have to overthink it. I'm trusting myself to say, this feels right, this feels right, this looks right. It is evocative of something. I'm not going to figure it out right here, but I've looked at this place enough from so many different angles that this is an image that I have to make. That's probably the best I can explain it, but it's not strictly instinctive, but it's not over intellectual either. It's me. It's everything.
And as Sukenya, the museum is a partner, right, in an artist being able to exhibit and showcase and get that vision out to an audience. And one of the people who has a critical role in that is the curator. When they're putting together the exhibit, right, the theme is established, the lens through which it's going to be framed and offered to the audience is important to the artist's intention as well.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of times when a curator looks at the work, the artist speaks to them in terms of fitting into the overall idea of the exhibition. What I really appreciate about this exhibition and the one before it is that there's such a diversity, and there's room to hear the voice of the artist. It's so important for the visitors and the viewers to see the videos, to see the work, to have a dialogue and talk about it. They ask a lot of questions, and the fact that we have information in terms of them being able to go to YouTube, and also the artist himself, Brian, having a website and having more information about the cemetery project um, is really is very helpful and a resource that the teachers often use within the classroom. A part of our mission for the Artmobile as we serve underserved communities is we want to make sure that we get the resources from the museum to the community. So that's distance learning information, teachers' workshops, student classes. We really pay attention to our distance, and what better way riding on the Artmobile or following behind the car in the car. You should see us. The Artmobile is 74 feet long. It's an 18-wheeler. Um, and it's
Yeah,
almost 14 feet tall. And when it
yeah,
opens up, it's a production. It
yeah,
opens up, it's about 22.5 feet wide, and it has an entryway, a door, and an exit, and both sides has steps. And
right.
oftentimes, you have people who are just fascinated with rigs. They want to talk about the automobile. And that's when you would
Yes,
love to talk to our
yes,
driver, William. He is awesome. He has been doing this for a very long time. And then
yeah.
when they step inside, there is um, controlled temperature. We have to make sure we keep the inside at 70 degrees. We control the humidity.
Right, right, right.
And when we're on the road, we take down the work. And then when we set up, we put up the work. But we don't just put up the work. We put up walls. We put down
Yeah,
the flooring, part of the flooring. So
right.
this production is
Yeah.
it's many hats. And when we talk about hats in terms of we count it an honor to be a part of the um, exhibiting, a part of the preserving. We count it an honor to make sure that the work stays safe. We have crates on board within the storage. And so we talk about that a lot when we talk to different groups in terms of if they're interested in exhibiting in the curatorial aspect, in the
Mm-hmm,
educational aspect, in the
mm-hmm,
financial aspect. We
mm-hmm.
have donors, corporate
Right,
donors and private donors, and how
right.
we want to be responsible with sharing the outcome or all that we've worked to do
Mm-hmm,
with everyone within the Commonwealth of Virginia.
mm-hmm.
I said a lot there.
It's a, you did, but it's a, it is production. And in
Yeah,
many ways, because you open up in a new community, it's a theater production, right?
that's
They see
correct.
you from, they see it, evolve and open up and start and go through the time and then wrap up. They really,
Yes.
have that kind of experience. I we are down. I think we've got just about a minute or two left. And I wanted to see if maybe each of you could speak for like 2 seconds on the film itself. I mean, how did you
Yes.
think that the film itself, captured, Brian, what you were trying to give it as you were doing it, what Sukenya thought it does for the production of the exhibit, and then we'll wrap it up. But I think we got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Yeah,
I
one
think
for you,
that
one for her.
I think the VMFA team did a really, really great job at both capturing my words and my idiosyncrasies. So I'm very, very appreciative and very, very happy with what they turned out in terms of the artistry as well as the editorial content.
Mm-hmm. Great, Sukenya.
I thought it was refreshing to see Brian in the cemetery,
Mm-hmm.
in the space, and
Mm-hmm.
to see the grass moving, and
Mm-hmm.
to see him walking through and to see the dog past his dog passed by. You know, there was a narrative there in terms of it felt like the cemetery was a part of his home. You know, it felt we saw his comfort. Some
Claimed
people
it.
are scared of cemeteries. You know, some people have a fear of, you know, of passing on. You know, and so it was a way to see it in terms of in a positive light, and also to really experience in terms of what it looks like, because one of the number one questions is, where is it? You know, as we travel out to Bristol, as we travel to Martinsville, as we go to the Virginia Beach or the Eastern Shore, where is Evergreen Cemetery? And so in terms of where it fits in location, you know, it's good to see a visual, even though we don't see the routing of the map, you know, we see the
Right.
place.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think it's also good for people to think about the fact that there may very well be, and there probably is, an evergreen-like place near them. Might not be as big, but there are hundreds of these places just in the state of Virginia alone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really true. This has been a really interesting conversation, and honestly, if we had another half an hour, we might get to, dig even deeper. But I thank you both for being in this conversation. Thank you, Anjali, for making this a part of the Afrikana Independent Film Festival for this year. I think that they're going to provide you with some Instagram handles and such social media ways of getting in touch with and seeing more of Brian's work, of Sukenya's and the museum's work, and of Sacred Ground Project will be there as well. But this has been really great. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to thank you as well.
Yes, thank you.
This has been a beautiful, free-flowing discussion, and I can't forget to thank Paula Robinson, Director of Audience Development at the museum, who actually connected the Art Mobile program to Afrikana Film Festival. So it has been a wonderful path in getting here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you all very much.